Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. I'm Robert Baylor, Director of Communications at NUCA. Welcome to our special NUCA member webinar on recent Davis-Bacon Act regulatory changes. First, before we begin, some webinar housekeeping for attendees. Today's webinar will be recorded. It will be available on NUCA's YouTube channel and via our webinar webpage, both of which can be accessed via nuca.com. All participants are muted upon entry. Phone participants can use *6 to mute and unmute themselves. Questions will be asked at the end of the presentation. To ask a question, you can submit a written question anytime using the chat feature, and I'll read them at the conclusion of our discussion. Now let's get started. Each year, the Davis-Bacon Act's prevailing wage regulations apply to roughly $217 billion in federal and federally assisted construction projects. The U.S. Department of Labor announced late last month its new Davis-Bacon regulations are effective October 23rd, less than 3 months away. These regulations will be enforced for projects receiving funding under the 2021 Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or IIJA. We are joined today by Ben Brubeck. Ben is Vice President of Regulatory Labor and State Affairs for Associated Builders and Contractors. In this role, he works with his team to shape policy on local, state, and federal issues important to the construction industry. His expertise across a portfolio of issues includes labor and employment, Davis-Bacon Act, workforce development, infrastructure, federal contractor regulations, and public works procurement. Our second expert is Jonathan Landesman, the top labor and employment attorney and partner in the Labor and Employment Practice Group of Cohen Seglias in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. John's expertise includes almost 20 years of Davis-Bacon litigation defenses for East Coast construction companies. We'll also hear from NUCA's Vice President of Government Affairs, Zach Perconti, about what next steps the NUCA and other construction industry advocates are taking over the months ahead to roll back these changes. Thank you all for joining us today on this special NUCA webinar. Ben, I turn the webinar over to you.
Great. Thank you for the kind introduction, and it's great to be here with all of you. You're not confused. I work for ABC, but I'm happy to do this for NUCA, ABC, Associated Builders and Contractors. For those of you who don't know, I know we've got many members that are also NUCA members. ABC is a construction trade association with about 23,000 member contractors and subcontractors, material suppliers in the industry. We've got 68 chapters all over the country, and we were founded in 1950. And one of the key issues that we were founded on is pushing back on Davis-Bacon regulation. So my perspective on Davis-Bacon is that we've got some problems with it, which I'll explain here. We've been for full repeal or reform in the absence of full repeal for a long time. And as you'll hear from the rest of my presentation, these changes that have been made by the Department of Labor and the Biden administration are rather radical and go back to previous standards and expand Davis-Bacon application to more projects and more work. And I'll explain a lot about that, as well as John will give you some practical information too. But I'm going to take about 15-20 minutes to kind of walk you through the basics of the law in case you're new to this issue and the changes that have been implemented and will be live at October 23rd, absent a legal challenge or something else that slows things down. So I'm really glad you guys are all here, taking time out of your busy schedules. I know a lot of you are in your very busy construction season, and I hope everything's going well and you and your employees are safe and productive. And hopefully this webinar will allow you to see what is going to happen in the public works projects that are affected by the Davis-Bacon Act and related acts. So here's some background real quick. This was passed in 1931, and it applies to all federal, direct federal agency construction contracts over $2,000. And that $2,000 threshold has remained relatively steady since it's passed. And I think we all know you can't build much for $2,000. So it basically applies to every federal contract. And then also Davis-Bacon related acts. There's more than 71 other programs that provide federal funding for public construction projects to state and local governments, as well as some private entities that are now covered by Davis-Bacon to some degree. This was mentioned earlier, but we know that Davis-Bacon and the related acts apply to about $217 billion in federal and federally assisted construction projects, covering about an estimated 1.2 million workers. And if you think about this with respect to overall construction put in place, the U.S. public construction put in place was about $363 billion, which is about a quarter of all construction put in place across the industry. And of that, just about $27 billion or 8% was federal government construction put in place. So A lot of government construction is subject to the Davis-Bacon Act. That's the key point. We've also seen recent unprecedented expansion of the Davis-Bacon Act or prevailing wage standards onto private construction work under legislation called the CHIPS Act and also the Inflation Reduction Act for chip fabrication as well as clean energy projects, respectively, which receive federal tax dollars or tax credits. And this is really the first time this has ever been expanded onto private projects through the tax code. So rather significant, and we will see a larger expansion of Davis-Bacon onto more private work as a result of this, which is going to be troubling for a lot of you who are familiar with prevailing wage and Davis-Bacon regulations, yet alone the new Davis-Bacon regulations that the Department of Labor has set out. So contractors under the Davis-Bacon Act are forced to pay the government-determined prevailing wages and fringe benefits to all trade workers, and trade workers are defined as laborers and mechanics on covered construction job sites. And the wage determinations are based off of a contractor survey and data from the contractor survey issued by the U.S. Department of Labor's Wage and Hour Division, and those wage determinations are published on sam.gov. And the compliance of the Davis-Bacon Act is enforced by federal government agency contracting officers and DOL Wage and Hour Division members. So it's kind of a combination of enforcement there, depending on how things are looking. Typically, it requires contractors to submit weekly certified payrolls to be collected and submitted by a prime contractor to the government contracting entity. The government registered apprentices covered at reduced rates in proper ratios. So there are apprentices allowed under the Davis-Bacon Act, but you've got to figure out what to pay them based on appropriate apprenticeship program pay and scale. And then the job classifications are determining wage and benefit rates are set by unions when the union rates prevail. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in the future, which is really what happens when union rates are adopted as the prevailing rate, or what happens when there's a blended average adopted as a prevailing wage. So DOL's Wage and Hour Division sets more than 130,000 unique wage and benefit rates through this survey process I just described. And it's rather complicated, the survey process, but for the purpose of time, I haven't gone through the entire process. But there's more than 12 or 13 steps to the process, and it can take years for the survey process to start and then to get the DOL to publish the wage rate for that survey process. And of course, the Department of Labor has been criticized for the amount of time it takes between the start of the survey and the actual publication of the wage rate. It can be 4 or 5 years, and therefore the wage rates are already out of date by the time it's published. But anyway, they survey 3,000 counties effectively for 4 different types of construction, which are known as building, heavy, highway, and residential. And then they survey the wage rates for each of the trades in the construction industry, like electricians, plumbers, roofers, carpenters, et cetera, in each of those marketplaces. Then the Department of Labor gathers that wage data via the surveys of the contractors, and those surveys often get poor response rates. So just a handful of survey responses may actually determine the prevailing wage rate under existing regulations and the new regulations. And the DOL Wage and Hour Division doesn't spend a lot of time and effort surveying different markets and states every year. There's sort of a rolling process, and it can take quite a bit of time to get every single state surveyed. So there's a lot of surveys that are out of date and maybe aren't accurate with what we would think is a prevailing wage. And then there's this discussion about what is a prevailing wage? Is it an average? Is it the most frequent wage rate? What is it? Well, under the current rule, it's the 50% rule or the modal rule, which is the most frequent wage rate that is in the responses to these surveys becomes adopted as the prevailing wage. And this is what it literally says: if a single rate is paid to a majority of the employees in a given classification or locality, it is adopted as prevailing. And note that the union collective bargaining agreement requires everyone in a trade classification to be paid the same rate. So the collective bargaining agreement rates are more likely to prevail when there are sufficient responses to a survey. And then if there's no single rate that is paid to a majority, the weighted average of all rates, which is union and non-union rates, are paid, is adopted as a prevailing wage. And that's what they call a blended rate or an SU wage rate if you look at the schedules. So they want to change the calculation from the 50% rule to the 30% rule. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. But the bottom line is under the old regime and the current regime, the unionized firms are more motivated to respond to surveys because if the union collective bargaining agreement rate is adopted, that makes them more competitive on public works projects. And that means they don't have to compete on wages and benefits. And then once a union wage rate is adopted as prevailing, it automatically updates every new collective bargaining agreement cycle. So essentially, these are union wage rates forever unless there's some objections and there's a complicated process to push back on that and to change those wage rates. But bottom line is that once these rates are recognized as union, they stay that way. In fact, the Office of Inspector General found that union wage rates prevail on 48% of the time. In a report in 2011, it was 63% of the time. 2019 was 48%. 2011 was 63%, which is remarkable considering that between 11 and 14% of the construction workforce is unionized. DOL recently said that just 42% of the wage rates were union. It's unclear how that could be and how that could be such a great drop since 2011. But that's what they said essentially in their final rule. And they said that the final rule that we're talking about will increase the percentage of union collective bargaining agreement rates that will be adopted by at least 50%. And they say the new rule will reduce the use of average rates by half, meaning more union rates. And that is the whole objective of the new Davis-Bacon regulation, is to make sure that union wage rates are adopted and used more frequently. For a long time, ABC and other stakeholders have pushed back on the Davis-Bacon Act. We believe that there's additional costs as a result of this. The CBO estimates that there's a $24 billion savings in over a decade if it were repealed. A number of other analysis suggests that Davis-Bacon wages tend to be inflated over 22% compared to market rates. Some other research has found that it increases the cost of construction by 7.2% and probably costs taxpayers an annual amount of $21 billion per year, which is much more aggressive compared to the conservative CBO estimate. But this could effectively result in additional costs, less construction output per taxpayer dollar, which means fewer investments in roads, schools, bridges, and other infrastructure. So taxpayers are getting less and paying more under the way that Davis-Bacon's calculated and the rules related to it. You also might be familiar with a number of concerns about the red tape and bureaucracy that impact businesses, especially small businesses. We know a lot of contractors avoid prevailing wage work because of the regulatory tape, the uncertainty that we'll talk about. The submission of certified payrolls can be problematic for some small businesses. There's additional risk and legal fees to interpret a lot of these unclear rules that Department of Labor used to have prevalent, and now they claim the new rule will address, but I think we're going to lead to more confusion and lack of clarity to some degree. A lot of contractors complain that workers are paid different wage rates for the same exact type of construction work on a private project versus a Davis-Bacon project or public work in an adjacent county. So they say this really doesn't reflect the prevailing wage rates and creates issues with their employees and as far as their rate of pay. It also can expose firms to potentially frivolous wage and hour violations due to the complexity and lack of clarity by some DOL regulations. And then it typically can increase the cost of construction, which again means fewer construction projects and less construction industry job creation. A lot of Davis-Bacon advocates claim that this is a great way to level the playing field and make sure this isn't a race to the bottom based on wages and benefits. They feel like this is an opportunity to make sure you compete on value and forcing everyone to compete not on wages and benefits, but on productivity and other types of areas of construction costs. So there are some folks, probably in NUCA and some even in ABC, who think that the Davis-Bacon Act is a good thing, but they disagree with how the wage process is done and how it's determined and so on and so forth. And to make things more confusing, there are state prevailing wage laws which actually use the Davis-Bacon rate determined by the Department of Labor at the federal government and apply that in their state prevailing wages. So there's actually a bleed into state prevailing wages. 21 states have no prevailing wage rates, but the remaining states, of those 8 of those states plus DC, use the federal Davis-Bacon wage rate. So you may see some reaction from some of these states that do set their prevailing wage based on Davis-Bacon rates. If they see these rates increase or become more confusing or not in line with area standards, they may repeal theirs or make some adjustments to that. So ABC for a long time has supported legislative activity and regulatory activity on Davis-Bacon repeal and reform. Like I said earlier, we support full repeal. We've also support reform, and we oppose the bills and amendments that expand the scope of Davis-Bacon onto more programs and more federally assisted state, local, and even private projects. We recognize that passing standalone bills or amendments on the Davis-Bacon Act repeal is opposed in Congress and even by some Republican lawmakers, and reform might be a different question depending on what you define reform as. And I think the reforms that we support have been to define the job classifications prospectively within Davis-Bacon, to make sure there's been no expansion of Davis-Bacon offsite work and private projects, timely wage rates set by the Bureau of Labor Statistics data from OES survey data as opposed to these convoluted and archaic surveys, the fringe benefit rates set by BLS data, and then we want to keep the Reagan administration reforms to Davis-Bacon Acts. And unfortunately, what the proposed rule does really is undermines all of these actual real regulatory reform proposals supported by ABC and a number of other groups in the construction industry. And this is something the unions like, and this is why they're celebrating this rule. So you all remember that in March 2022, they issued the proposed rule. And what it does is it makes significant sweeping changes to the Davis-Bacon Act regulations and undoes a number of regulatory changes enacted by the Reagan administration back in 82 and 83. There were more than 50 significant changes to the DOL's regulations, again, mostly to undo the Reagan reforms, but to add some additional wrinkles too. There were thousands of public comments submitted to the proposed rule. I know ABC submitted 70 pages of comments, and I know a number of other groups also submitted some too. So here we are today. The final rule was issued August 8th, and it's effective October 23rd. And so it's reopened a lot of settled policies, including nearly all the Reagan reforms that we have all been operating under the last 40 to 50 years. So ABC has long said that the new regulation is out of touch, and even more out of touch than the old regulations. The regulation was about 800 pages long. I'm sure that's some light reading for all of you. Almost 250,000 words. They estimated the cost of the final rule in 1 year will be about $40 million, with an additional $7.3 million annually thereafter. I think that's a light estimate. They estimate that about 184,000 contractors will bid on Davis-Bacon or Davis-Bacon related act projects. So this is going to have an impact on about 184,000 businesses. There's lots of red tape. DOL estimates that the regulatory familiarization costs are $200 per contractor, which is 4 hours of HR staff time at $50 an hour. I can't hear you because you're all on mute, but I'm sure you're all laughing because the regulatory costs are much greater than that as you dig into this and try to understand all of the changes. They also claim that prevailing wages have no impact on total construction costs, which I think we would disagree with, although you can have a healthy debate on how much that added cost is. And it was designated major rule by OIRA as well. So let's get into some of the what I call lowlights of the final rule. Could be highlights for some of you that like the new direction that this is going in. But these are some of the key points. And John's going to hit on a couple of these issues in a few moments too. So I don't want to take all of his thunder, but I want to run through some of the changes. I mentioned earlier that it changes the definition of prevailing in the survey to the discredited 30% rule instead of the current 50% rule. So we're going to see fewer wages setting what is a prevailing wage, which is the big dispute about what is prevailing wage. They're making it easier for just a few people to set the actual wage rate. The modal wages are given preference as opposed to averages, as long as you get that 30% rule. They were, because they have poor survey responses and poor data, they're going to allow urban rates to prevail in rural areas and allow urban rates to be used in the calculation of some types of Davis-Bacon wage rates in certain circumstances. It's going to expand the area covered by wage determinations, meaning site of work and types of projects to some degree, and John will talk about that briefly. And it also allows state prevailing wage data when states do their own prevailing wage surveys to be used to set federal rates when they don't have enough information from their survey process. Again, in some states, that's probably going to increase the cost of construction and the cost of wage rates. Remarkably, the final rule rejects the use of BLS data to come up with an actual prevailing wage that's timely and scientific, but they are okay with using the BLS Employment Cost Index to increase rates initially and then every 3 years while refusing to use BLS survey methods. And this is for the wage rates that are considered old or haven't been updated. And it's only for the non-collective bargaining agreement rates. So we expect to see a quick change at some point. We're not sure how long it's going to take, of all of these new wage rates that haven't been done in a long time. They'll be updated with BLS ECI rates, and we'll see what the final effect of that will be. There's some other issues here too that I'd like to not touch on because of timing, but I know that John's going to talk a little bit about the expansion of the scope of covered work, so I don't want to spend too much time about it, but there's been this big tug of war about what exactly does the Davis-Bacon Act apply to. We know it applies to construction projects, but does it expand to off-site construction, like prefabrication? The new rule has a number of sort of concepts about where it applies and how it applies. I think it sort of incrementally creeps into those areas, but they did retreat from its initial proposal to expand coverage to modular housing and construction that wasn't specifically for the project in question. So this was a win for the industry. It was a win for a lot of people who think that modular construction should not be subject to Davis-Bacon. And it also redefined construction to include transportation to some degree, and to cover some drivers and some material suppliers, although DOL said that it didn't apply as much as it initially suggested, which again, I guess you could say is a win. And then it explicitly covers some green installations, some demolitions, some surveying, some flagging, and others. I think John's going to hit on that. We're also seeing a lot of questions about fringe benefits related to this. A lot of questions about this annualization rule, which reduces the credit for non-union fringe benefits with some potential new restrictions. It's a pretty complicated topic to talk about, but bottom line is for those, this annualization rule is not going to be, it's not going to be something that changes based on a memo. It's going to actually be in the regulations, and this is something you got to look at closely if you have your own benefit programs. It's also going to require DOL to approve self-funded insurance and other fringe benefits. I'm not sure DOL has the capacity to approve all of these programs that now contractors are going to go ask for approval of. I'm not sure they've thought that through. It's something that's going to be a big issue for a lot of folks who are in that space. I'm not sure how many NUCA members do self-funded insurance and fringe benefits, but if you have a provider that helps you with that, make sure you ask a question of them suggesting how to go about this if you haven't done so already. There'll be no approval required for defined contribution pension plans with immediate vesting, and it's going to codify credit for administrative costs of fringe benefit plans, but restricted. So if you're in the fringe space, definitely keep a close eye on this area. Also, we're going to see tougher enforcement, enforcing by the operation of law, even if no notice of Davis-Bacon Act given in the contract clauses. This is a big trap for subcontractors. And what this means is that if the government procuring the construction contracts fails to include the Davis-Bacon Act requirements in the actual contract, it doesn't matter. The contractors are still on the hook for it, and the owner or the government is still in charge of making sure those wages are paid. And it basically says that the subcontractors and the prime contractors have to come up with a change order to cover those changes, even if it was the mistake of the actual procurement officer of the federal or local agency. So again, that's pushing for Davis-Bacon enforcement to a broader group of projects. And perhaps this is the right thing to do, perhaps, but it's going to create a lot of traps for contractors who may not be aware of this additional cost when they're bidding projects, should the procurement agency forget to include that. There's also cross-withholding on multiple contracts of prime contractors and affiliates, new anti-retaliation penalties included in the rule, increased chances for debarment of higher tier contractors, and more paperwork burdens on contractors. Two more slides here. The final rule rejects a number of meaningful reforms and alternatives that are reasonable, that have been suggested to fix the broken wage survey system. We still have a system that relies on archaic surveys. The system takes a long time to produce surveys. It may not be surveying the right people. These are typically people who are not doing federal construction contracts or federally assisted construction contracts, because if they did survey them, they would be repeating back the government wage rate. So they're looking for people to respond to a survey when they don't do government work. And that's why the response rates are partially so low. And again, the DOL has refused to use the BLS scientific survey methods as an alternative, but they'll allow for BLS over these older rates through this cost escalation index. So it's interesting that they're trying to have it both ways to some degree. And again, there's no change to Department of Labor's refusal to post job descriptions for most classifications. And so more union prevailing rates mean more union work rules will prevail with no guidance offered to non-union contractors. And what this is all about is non-union contractors want to bid on prevailing wage projects. They have workers who perform a type of work that they think should be covered by one trade and receive one wage rate. But if the union collective bargaining agreement prevails, the union collective bargaining agreement has rules that specify what kind of job classification and what kind of a trade should be performing that type of work. So the contractors are expected to find a collective bargaining agreement and interpret that. The problem is the collective bargaining agreements aren't published anywhere. And so that creates a sort of a compliance issue for a lot of contractors. They complain about the regulatory cloak and dagger nature of the Davis-Bacon Act. Related to this, despite years of stakeholders asking for DOL to publish those so that there's no confusion. When there is confusion, a lot of these contractors get hit with accusations that they owe back wages, they paid the wages wrong, et cetera, et cetera. It increases a lot of costs for them. So that's a quick rundown of all of the key points of this. I know John's going to hit on a couple of these, but I just want to share a couple things that we're looking at. What's next? One, I wanted to plug the Department of Labor is holding webinars the 13th, which is tomorrow, and the 14th from 1 p.m. to 3 p.m. If you go on the DOL website, you can register for those. You will hear probably a little bit of a different explanation of the Davis-Bacon final rule than what I've given you here, but they will be talking about it there. The question a lot of us are having is, when will this BLS Employment Cost Index escalator apply to these older non-collective bargaining agreement wage terminations? Will this happen all at once? Will this take 6 to 12 months and then kind of cascade? Or is this going to take 3 years to do? A lot of contractors were wondering if we're just going to see a huge jump in wages quickly once this is implemented in October. I don't think so. I think it's going to take some more time, but it's something that we got to take a look at. The next question contractors have asked us is, how often are the wage and hour surveys going to be conducted with this new 30% rule? When are they going to see the jump? Like I mentioned earlier, you really don't see too many surveys done per year, and they take 3 or 4 years sometimes to do. So we probably won't see a ton of new surveys with this 30% rule. It's going to take a couple of years for the system to push those out and have an impact. Questions here about, will the wage and hour division speed up the time to complete a survey or survey more markets? I don't know the answer to that. That's up to them. I doubt it, but it's possible that they were able to move forward with more because they have more data from alternatives. I'm not sure what their arguments are there, but they haven't fixed that at all. And then the other question is, will the DOL staff be able to handle these fringe benefits changes I mentioned earlier? And I think the answer there is probably going to have a difficult time, and that'll be something we'll be complaining about for the next few years as this gets moving forward. Other questions, is there going to be a legal challenge? I think ABC and a number of other groups are looking at this closely, and probably stay tuned for additional information on that. But there are some aspects of it that are subject to, I think, shaky legal grounds. I think the size and intensity of the final rule, 800 pages, goes to show that DOL was prepared for a legal challenge at some point and trying to cover their butts as much as possible. And the other question we have here is, will Congress tolerate new Davis-Bacon regulations? Will those who've liked Davis-Bacon suddenly change their tune once they see how aggressive this new effort is, rolling back more than 40 years of policy and making 50 changes and hurting small businesses and increasing the cost of construction? Those are all good questions. We don't know. And then we'll see, will states take action to repeal their state prevailing wage laws? Okay, before I turn it over to John to elaborate on some of these issues we raised, I want to make sure that you all had some resources. ABC's got some resources on Davis-Bacon. Our general counsel, Maury Baskin, has a briefer on the changes here. We've done surveys about the impact of Davis-Bacon on our membership, some good data points there. And then Heritage Foundation did a nice study looking at regulatory reform options and cost savings and the impact there. So with that, it's 3 o'clock. I promised I'd turn it over to John by now, and I'm happy to take questions at the end, but here's my contact information if you want to reach back out and follow up with any questions. So with that, I'll turn it back over to our folks at NUCA, and I really appreciate the opportunity to present to you, and hopefully this has given you all a good, quick overview of what we're seeing, and I look forward to speaking to you, more of you, at the end of the webinar. Thanks.
Ben, thank you for that excellent presentation. While our engineer gets John's PowerPoint up and ready, just remind you as well too, we take questions at the end. If you have a question right now you want to put in the chat before you forget it, please open up your chat feature. It's at the bottom of your screen, type it in, and I'll go ahead and read it when we do the Q&A at the end. John, if you're ready to go, I'll turn it over to you.
Absolutely. Thanks very much. And boy, oh boy, was Ben's presentation excellent. Just so filled with information and good commentary. I'm going to focus more on the compliance issues that I think contractors would face on a day-to-day issue to the extent that they're performing public works jobs. By way of background, I am an attorney. I'm the chair of the Labor and Employment Practice Group at Cohen Seglias. I've been here for over 20 years. We are a law firm that represents contractors. So, in any given year, we represent well over 1,000 contractors, and I've dealt with many, many prevailing wage audits and pieces of litigation adverse to the United States Department of Labor. So that's sort of my perspective looking at these things in terms of trying to help you learn from the mistakes of others and avoid some of these common pitfalls or compliance traps, especially some of the newer ones that are created by these recent changes to the regulations. Next slide, please. So, the regulations are not routinely tinkered with. It's been really, as we note here, nearly 40 years since they've been changed. And these new changes that we're talking about go into effect in just about 6 weeks now. Next slide, please. The fringe benefit rate and the wage rate. This applies to both the wage rate and the fringe benefit rate. And I'm not going to spend too much time talking about this because Ben had discussed it in detail. Really what we're doing now is reverting back to the pre-1982 three-step process for determining the prevailing wage rate and the fringe benefit rate. And the three-step process is essentially if a majority, over 50% of the wage rates in a classification are the same, then that's the rate. But if there's no majority, then the wage rate earned by the greatest number of workers, provided that it's at least 30%, is the wage rate. And then if not, they revert to the weighted average. And so what's the result of going from the 50% rule to the 30% rule? You can put politics aside and you don't have to pick a side. I think both sides of the aisle would agree that the result of moving from the 50% rule to the 30% rule is a move that's going to increase the number of prevailing wage determinations that match the union collective bargaining agreement scales that are out there. Next slide, please. So what happens when we have a wage determination and then it is updated or modified after the contract is awarded? The new regulations provide some clarity and state that the wage determination needs to be updated after a contract award in two circumstances. Number one, where the contract is changed to include additional substantial construction that's not within the original scope of the original contract, or the second circumstance is where the contract is changed to require the contractor to perform work for an additional time period that was not originally obligated. And that could include when an option is exercised on a contract or a change order. Let's take a look at the next slide, please. So one of the the issues, and this was alluded to by Ben as well. One of the issues that's addressed in these new regulations that's long been an issue that has caused headaches with respect to compliance with prevailing wage is the extent to which off-site work is covered by the Davis-Bacon Act. And so, this could deal with off-site custom fabrication. This could deal with batch plants, those sorts of things. Now, under the new regulations, there's sort of a revised definition of what work is covered when it's off-site. The current definition talks about the site of the work, including any site away from the location where the work is being performed, where a significant portion is performed, a significant portion of the building or the work is performed at that offsite, provided that the site is established specifically for the performance of the contract. So if you have an offsite location and it's adjacent or nearly adjacent, and it's established specifically for the performance of the contract, then under the old regulations, the department is saying that you're covered. Now we're expanding that, and we're not limiting those offsite locations only to locations that are established specifically for the performance of the contract. But now we look at offsite locations and we say that they're covered if they're dedicated exclusively or nearly exclusively to the performance of Davis-Bacon covered work. So it can be an existing permanent offsite location, like a batch plant or something like that, and it's going to be covered if during a period of time the work that's going on there is dedicated exclusively or nearly exclusively to the performance of the Davis-Bacon covered work. Let's take a look at the next slide. By the way, there are a number of issues. I'm just trying to flag them quickly in the time that we have that are sort of the highlights of the changes in this new regulations. So are flaggers covered? Yes, is more likely. The department has looked at the issue of flaggers working adjacent or virtually adjacent to a construction site as being on the site of work. But then we didn't have specifics in terms of what does it mean to be adjacent or virtually adjacent. Do the flaggers, how close do they need to be to where the work is actually being performed? So, if there's some excavation going on, do they have to be immediately standing right next to the excavation in the street? Do they have to be inside the cones or the barriers where the work is being performed? Can they be standing a bit outside of that? And the new rule clarifies that the flaggers are covered not only if their work at a location adjacent and virtually adjacent, but the regulations talk about the flaggers being covered even if they're a few blocks away or a short distance down the highway. And I know that this issue in certain parts of the country is leading a lot of companies that perform flagging work to have some major headaches. There have been a series of class action lawsuits in the New York area challenging flaggers and whether or not they're covered under prevailing wage law. So at least for Davis-Bacon, and my firm actually has been involved in several of those defending the contractors. Now, at least to the extent that there's Davis-Bacon projects, it's going to be a lot harder for contractors to come up with any sort of defense in those flagger cases. Let's take a look at the next slide, please. So material suppliers. Who are delivering materials have long been excluded from the definition of contractor, meaning that material suppliers who deliver materials aren't contractors. They don't have to pay the wage as the general rule. But of course, there's all sorts of nuance and exceptions to that. In the new regulations, the definition is expanded upon to make it clear that material suppliers are entities whose only contractual responsibilities are the delivery of material and supplies. And it goes on to specify that although a material supplier may both deliver and pick up materials, an entity that is solely engaged in picking up and hauling away materials is not going to be a material supplier. That's really just codifying existing rules about who is and who is not a material supplier. Under the old regulations, we had some wiggle room. It was called the 20% rule, for those of you who are familiar with it. The 20% rule essentially provided that entities could perform a certain amount of non-delivery on-site construction work, but still be classified as a material supplier instead of a contractor. Now, the new regulations, unfortunately for contractors, are eliminating that 20% rule, making it, of course, much more likely that the material supplier is in fact going to be deemed a contractor if they're performing any work on the site, even if it's below the 20% threshold, which no longer applies. Let's take a look at the next slide, please. So here's some additional clarifications, some additional changes that I've listed here, and there's a bunch of them. We'll just go through them relatively quickly because I do know that we want to leave time for questions. With respect to truck drivers, this new rule establishes and really clarifies that truck drivers who are employed by contractors have to be paid the applicable prevailing wage for on-site driving time that's unrelated to off-site delivery for any time spent transporting significant portions of public works from secondary construction sites, for any time transporting materials to or from adjacent or virtually adjacent dedicated support sites, as well as for any on-site time related to off-site delivery if such time isn't de minimis. So again, material supplier rules, truck driver rules, these are highly nuanced. The nuance is moving and changing, and it's not necessarily making it easier for contractors to comply. It's the opposite. For those who are involved in survey work, the new regulations address surveyors in particular, and instead of just establishing a bright line rule, which really has never existed, the department now is going to really focus and consider the importance of the surveyor's duties. And so, if you had a surveyor who spends a lot of time on a project, let's say taking measurements, they're going to be likely to be deemed laborers and mechanics as opposed to people who are excluded from the act. Apprentice ratios. I know Ben mentioned in passing apprentice ratios. If you have participation by a contractor in an approved apprenticeship program, it not only assigns certain wage rates to those apprentices, but also the contractor is required to stay within ratios. So it can be a 3-to-1 ratio of journeymen to apprentices, 4-to-1, 5-to-1, whatever it may be. The regulations now say that the ratio that's established by your BAT approved, Bureau of Apprenticeship and Training approved program is not portable. It does not follow the contractor to the jurisdiction where they're performing the work. So if I'm a contractor, let's say I have a program for electricians and it allows 3-to-1 in state A, but I'm performing work in state B, where it's got to be 4-to-1 or 5-to-1. Well, guess what? I have to abide by the 4-to-1 or 5-to-1, whatever is the applicable ratio that's mandated in state B, even though my apprenticeship training program, the home state would be the other state, in my hypothetical state A. So the flow down requirements, as they're called in the regulations, have been clarified. So when you have general contractors or upper tier contractors and they engage lower tier or subcontractors who fail to properly complete their certified payroll forms, fail to pay the rate, fail to properly annualize their fringe benefits, or otherwise fail to fully comply with the Davis-Bacon Act. What happens in these cases? You know, I'll tell you as somebody who represents a lot of contractors, typically the Department of Labor looks to the violating subcontractor first and tries to get the remedy or extract the remedy, the financial penalty, whatever it may be, the wages from that violating subcontractor. But if for some reason, the violating subcontractor doesn't have the financial wherewithal or is insolvent, then the Department of Labor goes up the chain and looks to the next higher tiered subcontractor or general contractor. And the new regulations sort of memorialize that and make it even easier for the Department of Labor to go after the higher tiered contractors. So all that this does is really place an even greater emphasis on the need to police and monitor subcontractors. So if you're doing prevailing rate work and you're subbing out a portion of that work, you want to keep a very close eye on those subcontractors. You want to get, you want to get copies of all the certified wage reports on a weekly basis. You want to make sure that the fringes are being satisfied and the wages are being paid, because if they're not, you're going to step into the shoes of that sub. Along those lines, the new regulations create actually a cause of action. They create a new claim for employees, which is never good news for contractors. Previously, if an employee complained and said, you terminated me for not paying me the correct rate, you paid me a laborer's rate, really I should have gotten a sheet metal rate or a whatever millwright's rate, that employee, could they bring a claim and say that they were retaliated against for bringing that complaint? Well, they'd have to get more creative and look to state law or other avenues of law, because the Davis-Bacon Act didn't have an anti-retaliation provision. Congratulations, thanks to these new regulations, it does, and so it creates that new claim for employees. With that, I think that I've probably exceeded my time, so I'll yield the microphone. Thank you very much for your attention, and let's go to the next slide. One after that. There's my contact information to the extent that anyone has questions or wants to discuss and we didn't get to it today. Feel free to reach out. Thank you very much.
John, thank you for that dive into details. That was tremendous. We're going to hear next from Zach Perconti.
I am here. Good
Marvelous.
afternoon, everyone. Once again, I just want to thank our speakers. We really appreciate them joining us and walking us through the changes to the Davis-Bacon final rule. I just want to talk about some of our next steps and let you all know how you can get involved. So as Ben alluded, industry is looking very closely at what next actions we can take. Legal challenges are certainly a consideration, and we'll be engaging closely with those who do choose to move forward, pushing back against the administration's changes in the courts. But we're also asking you all to help us get involved. We've been working directly with folks on the Hill, letting them know about our many serious concerns that we have with these new changes, as well as how we feel that they could negatively impact the success of federal infrastructure investment. And so we're going to be deploying the grassroots once again. There is a muster action center that is now live, which you'll be able to access through NUCA's advocacy webpage, that has a short letter to the administration and to Congress asking them to consider withdrawing or overturning the final rule before it goes into effect in October. Now, while we're not exactly expecting the administration to take any action like that, we want to go on record with as many people as possible to show that we have serious concerns about the way they've handled this rule. And we want to put as much pressure as we possibly can on the Hill to see if we can't get some sort of action taken through either the Congressional Review Act or other legislation that would undo some more of the serious changes contained within this updated regulation. This is going to be a long fight. This change is pretty consistent with a lot of the other actions we've seen come out of the Biden Department of Labor. And we're going to be dealing with this stuff, throughout the rest of 2023 and into 2024. So we really appreciate everyone's continued engagement and support. Please do look for our muster action message and take part in our campaign. And as always, if you have any questions about the work that NUCA Government Affairs is doing, please do feel free to reach out to me directly. You can reach me at zackp@nuca.com or through any of the contact links on our website. You can also call me directly at 703-677-6049.
Thank you, Zach. Let's now open the webinar to questions. You can use the chat feature to submit a question, and I'll read the question to the presenter. Or if you prefer, unmute yourself, state your name and company, and ask the question directly. Remember to remute yourself after you finish. So we have two questions. First one from Kathy. The requirement for phone numbers and email addresses of each employee is extremely burdensome for my workers. A number of them don't have emails and phones are shared. Will there be any wiggle room? If not, will there be penalties?
That's a good question. John, I don't know if you have any advice for your clients in this area. I don't. I'm not an attorney, so I don't like to play one when I'm giving advice to all of you. I do think this could certainly be a concern for a number of our members that are in a similar situation as you, Kathy.
Sure. And I started answering and then I realized that I muted myself. Sorry about that. I mean, the issue of turning over certified payroll forms with personally identifying information, I think has long been an issue for contractors. We don't want to give socials, we don't want to give phone numbers, we don't want to give other information. And so I know a lot of contractors dealt with that issue by preparing two sets of certifieds. The first set would be complete and unredacted. The second set would be redacted. Redaction, means it's a fancy way of saying taking a black magic marker and essentially blacking out the personally identifying information. And then when submitting it, indicating that to the extent that there's a FOIA request or other records request for public information made, that only the information that only the redacted copy should be given. To the extent that I've heard, and I don't know if this is actually in the regulations or something that I heard when speaking to an officer. I thought at the Department of Labor, I believe that the procedure was going to be altered somewhat to the extent that the contractor isn't going to submit two sets, but instead submits the redacted version, and then the department actually, in issuing them to, let's say, and if you're, and I'm not trying to make this union versus non-union, but if you're a non-union contractor, it's not that unlikely that a union business agent may make a request or a FOIA request for the records. In that event, my understanding now is that the department would do the redaction before issuing the records, making them available to the business agent or some other member of the public.
We have another question. It's from Hope. Regarding truck drivers, We deliver our equipment from our shop, usually to the job site. Is that time from the shop to the site and return trip apply to the new prevailing wage rules?
So I guess, Ben, I can address this one also. To the extent that the entity is a contractor, we're not talking about a material supplier, and they're spending time driving from the shop to the site, and then performing work at the site. I'd have to, I don't want to be, I want to be 100% clear. I don't believe that that would be covered time under the new regulations. I'd have to take a closer look just to make 100% sure, but I do not believe that that would be covered time under the regs.
Thank you,
Yeah,
John.
I'll
I'm sorry.
I'll just jump in and just say that the what's covered or not is pretty fact specific, and it gets a bit complicated to speak in generality. So we need to look at the reg closely and then interpret that, and then take a close look at what actually is being delivered and what the load is and all that kind of stuff. There's a lot of wrinkles. We were looking at this, and it's hard for us to give a blanket answer.
Thank you, Ben. Another question from Michelle. The conformance process was mentioned on a slide, but not talked about. What would the process for conformance requests be? We are a specialty contractor and our work equipment is rarely included in wage decisions. What would the process for conformance requests be?
Ben, did you want to talk about that one, or?
I can, or you can, totally up to you.
No, please be my guest.
Yeah, so conformances occur when there's a lack of wage data for a specific trade. And like what you said, you've got a lot of unique sort of job activities that effectively need a wage rate because the Department of Labor hasn't set one, right? This is a unique thing in the construction industry. It doesn't fall neatly into all these categories. What they're trying to say is that the Department of Labor will identify certain classifications where there's insufficient data and increase that through its wage survey process. So they're claiming that it's going to reduce the number of conformances needed by having all this new data and new classifications. I'm not sure that that's accurate, and I think there's still going to be a problem there. But their goal is to eliminate as many conformances as possible through this new process. I think that's why there's so many union wage rates adopted. Well, let's say that's the reason why there are so few union wage rates adopted according to their data, is that there's been more and more conformances issued that are not the union wage rate, and they're trying to eliminate those through this process. There's some additional comments about conformances in the 800-page rule that it's a little hard to exactly understand what their move is on this. And I'll be honest with you, there's some more experts on the conformance process that will know, okay, this is what this means at XYZ. But if I can get your information and give you some additional details on that, especially if you rely on the conformances quite a bit.
We've got time for one last question. We'll get this one from Chris. How about ready-mix concrete batch plants and delivery trucks? Also, precast concrete companies making and delivering products. Are they covered on the prevailing wage rules?
So that's an issue that actually we addressed during the presentation, and the rules for the material suppliers are really fact specific, and so I mean also the site of the work, and so when we're talking about the batch plants, we're looking at now the new test is whether or not the work being performed there is dedicated exclusively or nearly exclusively to the to the performance of the Davis-Bacon Act covered project. So we're going to look at it more on a case by case and answer that question. Is the work being performed at that batch plant dedicated exclusively or nearly exclusively to the Davis-Bacon project.
Thank you, John. We have one last question from Tim, and I think it's an important one. So if we're currently on a Davis-Bacon project, can the wage rates change on October 23rd?
So this is not going to cause this is John Landesman. It's not going to cause the wage rates to all of a sudden change on October 23rd as a result of the law going into effect. That's not what's happening here.
Yeah, that seemed like an important one, and you're absolutely right.
Yeah, but just to clarify, I agree with that. But we don't really know the timing of when the wage rates will, let's say, change or increase under this new 30% rule. Also, I mentioned the BLS has this escalation to bring older surveys in line. It's unclear when all that's going to happen. I think it's going to be more of a gradual than a sudden change. So you can kind of equate that to like the what is it, the frog in the boiling water? Eventually, they realize where they're at. I think we'll see some more of that over the long term, unless they really get aggressive and make these BLS escalations on the older wages quickly. And then they wait another 3 years to update them again as required in the regulation.
Ben and John, thanks very much for your time today. We'll go ahead and end the webinar. It looks like we're an hour into it. We'd also like to thank our many national partners for generously supporting NUCA and our monthly webinar series. Today's webinar has been recorded. Recording of this webinar will be made available on the NUCA.com website and on our YouTube channel over the next few days. I also put up the PowerPoints by the end of today. So if you go to NUCA.com/webinar, they should be up there for you. And thank you for your time today to join us for this special industry webinar and for supporting NUCA. Thank you for your time this afternoon. Please enjoy the rest of your week.